The topic of discussion today is writing a research paper with special focus on how to structure an argument and to write the research paper more effectively. We shall focus on the importance of academic structure. Now, writing a well-structured research paper is essential for presenting ideas logically and ensuring that the reader can follow a specific progression of ideas which frame the argument. So, an argument consists of a gamut of ideas. Now, these ideas have to be presented in a logical sequence. The logical progression of ideas in an academic answer or in an academic article which helps to frame an argument is what is known as structure. So, the structure of an academic paper or of an academic answer functions as a roadmap. It helps the writer to build an argument. A research argument is gradually built with the help of a clearly defined structure. So, it is a kind of roadmap. What do I mean by roadmap? It shows a specific pathway from the research problem to argument and finally in the conclusion, a meaningful conclusion. So, the pathway from a research problem to framing an argument to finding a meaningful conclusion. This is what is known as the structure of an academic paper or of an academic answer. Now, why does structure matter? Why is it important to focus on the structure before writing an academic paper or an answer? Now, there are various formats that are followed across disciplines. In humanities and social sciences, there is a special structure that is followed. In management or in other STEM subjects, there are different specifications for structure. But most academic research papers share a common organizational model. This includes several core sections. In any academic writing, that is, in a research article, there are some core academic sections that are common to all papers. And each section has a specific function. Each section contributes, in other words, to the paper's purpose. There is a research question, as I mentioned, a research problem. To investigate that research problem or that research question is one aspect of the structure. The second is to present evidence. Evidence-based arguments are developed. That is the second aspect of the structure. And finally, the outcome of that research is expressed in the form of research findings. So this is a kind of template. It is a common template, a common organizational model that is used for academic writing across all disciplines. This is, in other words, a common structure that can be kept in mind. Structure also works as a kind of epistemological tool. It is a kind of method that helps to shape any kind of critical inquiry. The structure will enable us to formulate a method of critical inquiry that is persuasive and that is accurate. So, structure is the base of any research article or any kind of academic writing, because what it does is that it transforms research into knowledge. How is knowledge produced? Knowledge is produced through argumentation, and argumentation depends upon the structure of the paper. What it also effectively achieves is that it shapes the inquiry, the research inquiry that is engaged upon. So therefore, the structure of a research paper is very important. How else can we understand the structure of an academic paper? We must understand that structure in academic writing is a system of organizing ideas. So, in other words, I can define structure as a system of ideas. It is a system of organizing ideas. There are, of course, as I mentioned, various conventions as per the discipline, but it is in general a kind of rhetorical strategy. It is a rhetorical strategy primarily because it helps authors to construct argument and to engage in a scholarly conversation. Also, it guides the readers towards new knowledge. So, the progression of ideas in an academic answer or an academic article is called the structure. And to share a basic tip on how to develop structure, in practical use, before writing an academic answer or any academic article, it is important to frame or to put down on paper what is called a flow chart. Now, a flow chart can be prepared ahead of writing an academic paper. All this while I was explaining to you how there is a pathway, how there is a system of ideas that are developed, that is an integral part of the structure. But what is the practical use? How do we put it to practical use? It is by designing a flowchart. A flowchart which can demonstrate to us at a glance the progression of ideas, how one idea is followed by another, how one idea is supported by the other, and how this can help us develop a scholarly conversation or an academic discourse. So, one tip to remember before writing any academic answer or paper is to draft, to design a flowchart. When we talk about the structure of an academic paper, we must understand that a research paper does not merely narrate facts. It is not a presentation of facts and figures. There are claims that one must, academic claims, authoritative claims that we must put forward. And this must be supported by evidence. A claim must be backed up or supported by, substantiated by evidence. So therefore, you see, the structure provides a logical framework. It provides the logical framework within which persuasion can occur. So my task as a researcher is, when writing an academic article, is to convince, is to persuade the reader about my point of view, about my line of argumentation. And how can I do that? I can do that through a logical structure, a concrete structure. So each section of a research paper plays a distinctive role. It plays a very important role in the progression of the argument. And what it creates is a coherent narrative of inquiry. Coherence is critical while structuring a research paper. If there is no coherence of ideas or correspondence of ideas and arguments, then the structure of the paper is faulty. Here, let us stop and let us think about the structure of a paper as logic and persuasion. Now, a well-designed research paper follows what is called a deductive logic. That is, it helps the reader to move from a broad issue to a specific problem and finally towards a resolution. There is a funnel approach or a funnel method that is used, and we shall elaborate upon this later. But the research paper always follows a deductive logic. From a broad problem a general problem, it moves towards the specificity. It moves towards the details of the argument and finally the resolution. This logical movement is essential for the readers because it emphasizes the gaps in knowledge and finally how knowledge is created or constructed in the process of academic work. Now let us pause here for a short quiz. And the question is, a well-structured research paper follows which of the following? A well-structured research paper follows which of the following? And there are 4 options. A reductive logic. B, a deductive logic. C, a persuasive logic. And D, a system of logic. And yes, you guessed correctly. The answer is B, a deductive logic. A well-structured research paper follows a deductive logic. That is, certain deductions are made. Broadly speaking, the problem is stated and certain deductions are made on the basis of argumentation and evidence. So the answer is B, a deductive logic. Now, when we are structuring a research paper or an academic answer, the first component is the introduction. We always begin an academic answer or a research paper with an introduction. So the introduction serves as a kind of anchor. It anchors the paper by defining the research problem. In the introduction, it is very important to state the research problem or the research question. There should not be any ambiguity in the mind of the reader regarding what is the research problem or the research question. The introduction must clearly define and delineate the research problem or the research question. Now, many scholars have commented on the importance or the relevance of a good introduction. One among them is John Swales. John Swales in 1990, while talking about the methods of academic research and writing, argued that the introduction follows what he calls a create a research space model. I repeat, create a research space model. Now, what does John Swales mean by this term, create a research space model? This is a specific model that Swales thought could be useful while writing the introduction. That is, it moves from context to gap to purpose. Context to gap to purpose. That means that the introduction must provide the context of the research. Thereafter, it must state the research gap, and then finally, it must also reflect upon the purpose of the research. So the writer must, in the introduction, persuade the readers that the topic is relevant. Why should somebody read the research article? The purpose or the relevance of it has to be mentioned in the introduction itself. Now, also very important, in structuring an answer or structuring a research paper is the thesis statement. That is, if there is a research problem, then there is also a statement, a research statement or a thesis statement. The research question or the thesis statement must be projected in the introduction itself. I cannot therefore beat around the bush. I establish context, thereafter I mention what is the research gap, and it is within this research gap that I situate or locate my own research question or my thesis statement. So therefore, a clear thesis has to be presented in the introduction itself. That must be a part of the structure. In the opening structure or the introductory structure of a research paper must contain the thesis statement. A clear thesis, remember, is not merely descriptive, but it is argumentative. It has to be argumentative. It signals also the writer's stance, his point of view, And it also demonstrates the direction of the analysis. It must project, it must reflect the direction of the critical analysis. That is, it must prepare the readers for the course of the arguments that are to follow. So if the thesis statement is weak, a weak and an implicit thesis statement results in fragmentation. So you see, the structure in itself becomes fragmented. It lacks any argumentative focus if the thesis statement is not directly and explicitly mentioned in the introduction. So you see how it can affect the overall structure of the academic answer or the research article. If the thesis statement is missing in the introduction, it leads to a fragmented structure, or it leads to a complete lack of focus. The reader, in other words, would not know how the arguments would proceed if the thesis statement is not clearly mentioned in the introduction itself. So a strong thesis statement must be proposed in the introduction. This is one of the key aspects of structuring a research paper. Next is a literature review. Now, very often, many students, many scholars tend to skip the literature review because they think it is not essential to their argumentation. But remember, no research paper exists in isolation. The literature review demonstrates a sense of awareness, our awareness of what other scholars have argued. The pre-existing scholarship in a particular field is demonstrated through the literature review. So therefore, there are two things in terms of the structure of the academic paper. There are two things that the literature review helps us establish. One is recognition, that is acknowledging the existing research and influences. And second is differentiation, identifying how our work or how the work that we are engaging in is different from the work that has already been produced. So in terms of the structure of the paper, there are two important aspects that the literature review helps with. One is recognition, recognizing the existing research, and the other is differentiation. What sets our work apart from that which has already been done. Now, we must also, in terms of the structuring a research paper or an academic answer, we must also spend some time to reflect upon the theoretical framework. What is a theoretical framework? To explain very simply, it is choosing a particular lens for interpretation. So every research paper that we know relies on conceptual assumptions. And a theoretical framework or a theoretical framework section in the research paper foregrounds these assumptions. It shows that the author will use a particular framework or a particular lens to interpret the data or to interpret evidence or to interpret the text. So for instance, if there is a study on media representation, then it could draw on postcolonial theory, it could draw on feminist theory. Theory, in other words, provides a vocabulary for analysis, and it is important. It is an important criteria for selecting evidence. Also, it helps us to justify our claims. Our claims cannot be unfounded. They have to be justified on the basis of a theoretical framework within which our research is grounded, within which our research is embedded. So therefore, it is important in terms of structuring a research paper, it is important that the researcher also mentions the literature review. The literature review cannot be omitted at any cost. Now, the other thing that is important while structuring a research paper is methodology. Now, what is methodology and what does it ascertain? The methodology in a research paper ascertains the credibility of the process. In empirical research, methodology is very important. It is almost the cornerstone of any kind of academic transparency. Details of how the data is gathered or interpreted or evaluated can be explained through the methodology section. Otherwise, you see, in social sciences or in pure sciences, it is difficult to validate the claims that have been made. But even in humanities, in academic writing for humanities disciplines, methodology is sometimes implied. It is not explicitly applied, but it is implied. So sometimes you will see that in research papers written in humanities subjects, methodology does not occur as a standalone section. There is no separate section that is devoted to methodology, but writers must nonetheless clarify how they analyze texts or cultural artifacts. That always contributes to the rigor of the research, the scholarly rigor, as well as it gives credibility to the research that is conducted. Now we will pause here for a brief quiz. The question is, how is the credibility of the research process reflected in the structure of academic writing? I repeat, how is the credibility of the research process reflected in the structure of academic writing? And the options are A, through the thesis statement, B, through the background, C, through the methodology, and D, through the theoretical framework. So among these four options, if we think about the best fit, or if we think about the best answer, then we would know that the credibility of the research process can be ascertained through the methodology. So therefore, the correct answer to this question is option C, through the methodology, not the thesis statement or the background or the theoretical framework, but the methodology. That helps us to confirm the credibility of the research process. Now, after these, moving on, we must think about the discussion and the analysis part of the answer or the research paper. In terms of structure, this is the body of the paper or the research work, the discussion and the analysis. Discussion and analysis is a section where the argument takes shape, it takes form. So this section is considered to be the intellectual core of the research paper. And therefore, what is important in this section is to write structured paragraphs. Structured paragraphs, each containing a claim, evidence, and interpretation. It is not merely sufficient to state the claim and to provide evidence. We must include our interpretation of the same. So the writer in this section transforms a set of data or bare facts into meaningful academic discourse. So in this section, we must understand that how do we structure this section? How do we do it more effectively? We can do it through the Peel model, that is P-E-E-L, the Peel model. This represents a certain model of structuring a research paper that can be effectively used. And it can be used across various disciplines in any condition or at any academic level. The Peel model, to elaborate on this, P here stands for point, E stands for evidence, the second E stands for explanation, and finally L stands for link. So Peel, point, evidence, explanation, link. Now what is point? Point is controlling the idea of the paragraph. Every paragraph must have a specific point. There has to be a point that it makes. It cannot be superfluous to the whole answer or to the research paper as a whole. So the point is the controlling idea or the key chief idea in the paragraph. Next is evidence. That is, what is the supporting material? The supporting material that grounds the point. Next, explanation. Explanation means analysis. Analysis showing how the evidence supports the point. So evidence is always followed by explanation. And finally, link. What is the meaning of link? Link is connecting the paragraph back to the thesis statement and forward to the next idea. Link is very important because you see it achieves two functions. One is that it connects the point made in the paragraph back to the thesis statement, the primary thesis statement that has been mentioned in the introduction. What it also does, on the other hand, is to connect this point to the next or the following point in the following paragraph. So this is the Peel model. While structuring an academic answer or an academic paper, it is very important to keep in mind the Peel model. Point, if we think about it in terms of steps and function, the first is in Peel model, the first is point. Point, what is the function of the point? It is to introduce the main idea of the paragraph. Evidence, it can be done by providing a citation or an example. You think about how to present evidence. You can either do it by citing a scholarly work, or you can do it by providing an evidence. Explanation is simply analysis of the evidence. This analysis has to be original. It has to be on the basis of all the critical material that has been examined in the literature review. And finally, the link, that is to tie it to the thesis argument and to also indicate transition to the remaining ideas that will follow later. Now, why is this Peel model so important, and why can it help us with, how can it help us with structuring an answer, an academic answer? Firstly, it helps us to clarify the argument. The argument has to be clarified through well backed up points, and this can be done through the Peel model. Secondly, it prevents descriptive writing. It does not allow us to digress or write excessively. Third, it supports logical progression. A logical progression of ideas can be maintained through the Peel model. It enhances the coherence of an academic paper or an academic answer. And very importantly, it strengthens the thesis. The thesis statement is strengthened by the Peel model, which can help us structure the research paper. Now, in the conclusion of a research paper is also an important part of the structure. Now, the conclusion is not an afterthought. Very often while writing, we do not pay attention to, or we are not mindful about the conclusion. The conclusion almost comes as an afterthought, but it is of strategic importance in terms of structuring a paper. Because the conclusion will reaffirm the thesis statement. If a thesis statement has been made in the introduction, it has to be reaffirmed in the conclusion of an answer. Second, the conclusion will demonstrate the broader significance of the findings. What are the research findings? What are the concluding remarks? This has to be mentioned towards the end of the answer or the research paper. And finally, what are the implications? If anything is implied for future research or for future reference, that is also mentioned in the conclusion. It is one important tip that is to be followed is in the conclusion, please do not introduce any new or unrelated idea, because what it will do is it will completely dismantle the structure of the answer. The answer structure must have a conclusion, but the conclusion is basically a tying up of all the ideas that have come before. Please do not introduce any unrelated ideas in the conclusion, because it undermines the structural cohesion or the structural coherence of the academic answer. The common structure, just to elaborate on the common structure of an answer or an academic paper, is that one must begin with a title. Now, in this regard, please remember that choosing the correct title is very important, because the title is the first point of entry. These are minor points in structuring an answer or in structuring a research paper, but we tend to overlook them. Title is also very important. It may seem to be a minor point, but it is important because it conveys the focus of the study. It includes essential keywords and it introduces the central concept. So we can begin with the title of the paper, moving on the abstract, the introduction, wherein you will have the thesis statement, the literature review, the theoretical framework, the methodology, discussion or analysis, and finally the conclusion. We have examined all of these separately. These sections have been dealt with separately. To conclude, very often you will find that there is a list of references or works cited in a research paper. Not so much in an academic answer, but in a research paper, there is always a list of works cited or a bibliography. These references are very important because it enables the readers to look up the material that has been referred to or that has been cited in the academic article. Also, we can avoid plagiarism, and we can give due credit by including the references and the work cited. Sometimes, depending on the kind of research that is undertaken, there is also an appendix that is attached to the end. Let us conclude now with a quiz question, and that is, what does PEAL stand for? We mentioned this particular term through the lecture, PEAL, P-E-E-L. So what does PEAL stand for? There are 4 options again. Option A, point, evidence, explanation, link. Option B, point, explanation, evidence, link. Option C, point, examination, evidence, link. And option D, point, elaboration, evidence, link. To think about once again, to revisit, what does PEAL stand for? P-E-E-L. P stands for point, E stands for evidence, the second E stands for explanation, and L stands for link. So what is the correct answer to this question? It is option A. Point, evidence, explanation, link. Finally, to conclude, we must try to understand that there are certain practical tips that could be shared or that could be followed to help us structure a paper better. To begin with, draft an outline before writing. I had mentioned a flow chart. Please ensure that there is a flow chart that is in place, that there is a rough outline before writing an academic article or an academic answer. Next, write the introduction. An introduction is helpful because it foregrounds the basic ideas. It can describe the process. It can give conceptual or information that can help the readers understand the subject better. Write the introduction, a meaningful introduction. Next, you can use in academic articles, sometimes there are subheadings that are used. These can help flag up arguments. But if subheadings are not being used, then please frame paragraphs. That is the body, the discussion or the analysis. Frame paragraphs. A paragraph consists of maximum 8 to 10 sentences. Maintain one idea per paragraph. This method, one idea per paragraph. And finally, revise the flowchart and write a conclusion. Write a conclusion that strengthens the thesis statement and supports the logical progression of ideas. Thank you.